Afternoon, Saints. Welcome to our Bible reflection session. Today we'll be reflecting on day 88 of our Bible reading plan. In this session, we will be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 9 to 12. In these chapters, it's where God appoints Saul as king over Israel. We hear of where he comes from and how he ends up meeting Saul, and we also hear of the prophecy that God gives to Samuel about Saul, and then also we later hear of the different prophecies that Samuel reveals to Saul. In the later chapter, in chapter 12, we also hear of the victory of Saul over the Philistines. I think for today's reflection, for me, I would like to just look at how God is still able to remain faithful even when we are not. How God is still able to remain faithful even when we disobey. Even sometimes when our own actions are not very logical, God still remains faithful. He still protects us. He still allows us victory. And maybe just to show you why I'm saying that, I would like to just start off where the pastor ended. So when the pastor ended, she was talking about the request of the Israelites to have a king appointed to rule over them. So and this is really, for me, something that got stuck in my mind when I read this particular chapter. So this is now chapter 8, around about verse 9. So in verse 9, we hear that the Israelites' elders approaches Samuel. They say they would like the neighboring countries, they would like to have a king appointed and to rule over them. Of course, in this chapter, they do mention the reasons why they would like to have a king, rather, and they do mention the fact that Samuel's kids will, they're not necessarily following the ways of Samuel, so they wouldn't be able to be judges over them. However, Samuel is clearly displeased because to this point, the Israelite nation was being led by God himself. Of course, God used judges like Samuel and Eli before that to be able to talk to his people, to convey his messages, and also for them to take messages to God via these judges. So he does take this to God. So he takes this to God, and God is clearly also not pleased with this request. However, God does say to Samuel, okay, let's grant them this wish. But God says, do warn them of how these kings will rule over them, and how this king will, and what this king will do to them. If you read chapter 8, verse 11 to 18, it's just basically where Samuel is talking about how he will rule over them and what he will do to them, and how that he will make them slaves, and he will take a portion of their estates. He will take a portion of their earnings, things like that. So I think when I read this, that this is probably the way in which these neighboring kings were ruling their nations. These neighboring kings were treating their subjects. I think that's probably how they were treating their subjects. And then Samuel is just reminding them that this is what your fate will look like. Okay, so I think that's probably where he got it from. Surprisingly, after mentioning that, the Israelites still felt that they still want to go ahead. They still want to have a king appointed over them, which is really quite odd, honestly. So I also think that the key lies in the fact that when they talk about having this king, they speak about this king will fight for us. So I think clearly they think that they will gain victory if they have a king rule over them. And for me, it's quite a surprise, because if you think about their journey from Exodus, it's clear that God has been superior. I mean, God has been amazing in terms of how He has rescued them, and all the miracles that they experienced. I mean, you would think that at this stage they will know that their God is almighty, and feel that no human being can come close to God. But nevertheless, the Israelites still feel that they would like to have a king. What is amazing for me, really, what baffled me when I read these chapters, was the fact that even when they disobey, and by disobeying, by wanting to have a human rule over them, and also showing lack of trust in God, even though they are so quick to forget where they come from, where God has taken them from, God doesn't just grant them this wish and say, "Go, okay, I'm letting you go and choose your own king and do your own thing." But God doesn't do that. God still is faithful. And maybe to explain that, I'd like to read chapter 9, verse 15. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of the Benjamin. I note him ruler over my people, Israel. He will deliver them from the hands of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cries has reached me. Clearly, you can see how God is faithful. From the scripture, of course, if you read further, there's more and more of this for you to fully understand the fact that God does anoint him. He does give him his. He does give Saul his spirit. It says here. Let's read that. Chapter 10, verse 6. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hands finds to do, for God is with you. So you see that even though God was quite displeased with the fact that the Israelites wanted to have a king, God still anoints a king. He still appoints a king, and then he basically fills this king with his own spirit, and he changes this man, and allows him to be able to have victory over the Philistines. So I think for me, that's also quite, I think for human beings, it looks illogical, because usually if someone goes against a decision that you feel is the right one, or if someone decides to do things their way, even when you've advised them otherwise, you will just say, okay, go do your thing. And then when they fail, you would like to say to them, but you see, I told you. But this is not how God does things. God allows them to have victory over the Philistines. God hears their cries, even when they've disobeyed, even when they're choosing not to obey. He still hears their cries. And if you remember before this, the Israelites had lost to the Philistines, not because God is not powerful, but because they were disobeying, they were worshipping foreign gods. But even when they've not come to a realization that this is their fundamental mistake they're making, God still grants them victory. God still hears their cries, and He still gives them victory in this way they've requested, even if this is not really the correct solution. The correct solution would have been just to obey God and follow God. So this just reminds us that God is merciful. God is loving. He will remain protective over us. He will still protect us. He will still hear our cries, even if where we are is a result of our own action. God still is trustworthy. I do want to say in closing that I think what is important is that we need to learn to ultimately follow the lead of God, because this is where we get the ultimate victory in our lives, because we know later on that Saul does fail. He's only human, and then we see his flaws, of course, later on in the later chapters. So I encourage us to keep following Lord, the plans of God, and keep following our Lord Jesus Christ.